All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachema, Benjamin and Elys Wohl from the Tanya Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of Sora and Sara this month in honor of Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson, who enable all of those outside of our physical Bais Midrash to be able to participate and partake of our Torah. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the Sora and Sara this month in memory of Sergeant Nicholai Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who died in a Hezbullah ambush in southern Lebanon on February of 1998. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Larry and Lara Franks, in the zechus refuah sheleima for Chaya Mira Bas Sora and Sara Bas Elisheva. Our Daf Yomi sponsorship for this week, Yanky Aliza Statman, in the zechus refuah sheleima for Chaya Rivka Bas Nechama. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos and Aliyah, all of those who require refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. I don't know how Rabbi Richter did it. Baruch Hashem, I finished the parak yesterday, which is incredible. Certainly made life a little bit easier for this morning. Baruch Hashem. So today, we have the incredible zechus to begin the 8th parak of Meseches Gittin. Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph 77a. Says the Mishnah, Hazorik get li'ishto v'hibasal beis. So I'll say this is a very exciting Gemara today, because a lot of new concepts that we really have not focused on at all over the course of the Masechta so far. It's really exciting. Hazorik get li'ishto. So a man throws a get to his wife. Shabbos says, "V'hi b'soch beisa, v'hi b'soch beisa, o b'soch chatzera, hazir arezun gereshes." If she is standing within her home, or she is standing within her chatzer, ultimately, again, she is divorced. Now, I will say, so obviously, what we're talking about over here is he's throwing a get at her, or throwing a get to her. She's obviously not catching the get, right? That's not the case over here. She's not catching the get. The get is landing on the ground. So now the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, if she's standing in her home, or if she's standing in her chatzar, she has the ability to be divorced by dint of the fact that the get is landing in her property. Now, what the mechanics of that are, we'll talk about in just a little bit. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, "V'hi b'soch beisa shal michsei mulog v'zarku la al gabe karka." So we'll say, obviously, the Gemara says, what's the case of her property? Michsei mulog. Remember again, I will say there are two different types of property that a woman brings into marriage. Nichsei mulog or nichsei tzon barzel. Both are the same in that wife retains title to both of those properties. Husband gets usage of both of those properties. Wherein lies the distinction? Nichsei tzon barzel, he guarantees the value of the property. So in other words, whether the property appreciates or depreciates upon death or divorce, he or his estate are going to pay the value of the property, versus that's called nichsei tzon barzel, like iron sheep. It retains its property, it retains its value, versus nichsei mulog, where she retains title. Whatever is or isn't left of the property, and as of death or divorce, ultimately again goes back to her. Fine. Either way, the point is, she's standing in her house, or she's standing in her property. Husband is throwing the get, right, into her chatzar, into her house, into her chatzar, she's divorced. But I will say, how is she being divorced? There's a concept in halacha called a kinyan chatzar. A kinyan chatzar, literally again, your property has the ability to acquire on your behalf. That's what's unfolding over here. Utilizing kinyan chatzar to allow her to be divorced. Beautiful. Zarkula, we're going to obviously talk more about that, but Zarkula b'soch beiso, or b'soch chatzero, so I will say, so let's say he throws it, right, and it lands in, she's standing in his house, or she's standing in his chatzar, and he throws it to her. Halacha l'maisa afilu hu ima b'mita, even if he is with her in bed. That's awkward, right? But right, eina migureshes. Ultimately, again, in these cases, she's not migureshes. She's not migureshes. I will say, why is she not migureshes? Because l'maisa. Something wrong. Was working. Right? She's not migreshes ultimately again because halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, it's landing in his property. So the Gemara says as follows, L'socheka or l'soch kalsa. What happens if halacha l'maisa, he throws the get? And I will say, so remember, case one is she's standing in her home, her chatzar. Okay? Get lands ultimately again in her property. Halacha l'maisa, she's divorced. That's case one. Case two, she's standing in his chatzar, his home, not divorced. Case three is an interesting case. Case three is she's standing in his home. So what does he do? He throws the get. It lands in her lap. Lands in her lap. Or the soch kalsa. Kalsa is her basket. Rashi points out over here it was a basket that women often kept with them, and they kept like needles and thread. Essentially, it's the Talmudic equivalent of a purse. Right? So so case number three is she's standing in his property. He throws the get. It lands in her lap, or it lands in her purse. What's the halacha? Haresu migureshas. Ultimately, again, she is divorced. She is divorced. Right? So Lamaisa again, I will say, so what's the chiddush of that case? The chiddush of that case is that halacha Lamaisa, even though she is in his property, her body or her utensils are able to acquire in his property. So we'll discuss that. So we'll say, so again, case number one is what we're going to start with. Case number one is we're being introduced to the concept of kinyan chatzar. That when a woman is standing in her home, a woman is standing in her chatzar, and the husband throws the get, and the get lands in her property, ultimately, again, she is divorced. Says the Gemara, Menahani Mili. So we'll say, where do we know this from? Now where do we know what from? Now we'll say, now remember, the Torah, when speaking about Gittin, tells us, V'nasan biyada v'shilcha mibeso. Torah says it's a process for giving a get. What's the process for giving a get? Husband takes a get, and what does he do with it? V'nasa biyada. He gives it, he puts it into her hand. So I will say, so from a biblical perspective, when you read the pasuk, again, without extrapolating anything, there's a way that divorce occurs. How does divorce occur? Husband puts a get into his wife's hand. That's it. That's get. So from where do I know this idea? That there's a concept of kinyan chaser? To which the Gemara says the Tana Rabbanan. Here we go. V'nasan biyada. Torah says he gives it into her hand. Ainli ela yada. I only know that he delivers it into her hand. Gago chatzera karfifa minayin. How do I know that if he delivers the get onto her roof, into her chatzar, her courtyard? We'll say karfif is an enclosed area. Minayin. How do I know that works to affect divorce as well? Talmud lomar v'nasan mikol makom. We focus on the word v'nasan. V'nasan means he will give, right? He will give or he will place. And we learn that to teach us that even not into her hand, but rather into anything that is her property. Now take a look at Rashi. There's more to this drasha. Rashi says, Tam lo v'nasan mikol makom v'dashino me'ba'an pei nafshei midlok sev ubiyada yitnenu mashmala nesina kol dhum. So this is very interesting. See, had the Torah just wanted to limit the ability of a husband to deliver a get into the wife's hand, right? There would have been a more specific way to write it. How would you have written it? Biyada yitnena. In her hand, you will place it. The fact that it uses a more generic lashon of v'nasan biyada, tells us, we'll say that the operative phrase, here's what's interesting, the operative word is v'nasan. He has to give it to her. Now, how does he have to give it to her? So we'll say, so biyada becomes a bit more descriptive than location specific. Biyada means the get has to be given over into a place that is like her hand. Rashi says, Deba'inun dumya diyada demishtameres ladaita. So we'll say, this is fascinating. So the Torah, so again, had the Torah just wanted to say the get could only be delivered into her hand, there would have been a better way to write it. How would you have written it? Biyada yitnena. In her hand it shall be placed. That would have been limiting. Right? Now that it says v'nasan biyada, give it into her hand, really, v'nasan. Husband has to give a get to his wife. How does he have to give it? In a way that is like biyada. Now we'll say, what does that mean? Just like her hand, we're going to talk about this more, is mishtameres. Mishtameres means it's guarded and secure. So too the get has to be given over into any location that is mishtameres, guarded and secure. Guarded and secure. We're going to expound on that a little bit. So I'll say, so from there we learn that what? From there we learn halacha l'maisa that the get could even be delivered into her home, her bayis, her chatzar, her courtyard, her karfeif, her enclosed area, as long as the area is mishtameres. So we'll say, let's just talk about this just for a second, then we'll see in the Gemara. What does mishtameres mean? Mishtameres means quite literally guarded. That it's the kind of place that people could put stuff in, and what? The item is not going to get taken or stolen. So it could either mean the area is enclosed, or it could also mean that the woman is standing right there, asserting her ownership over the area. So now what we've just learned is something amazing. A get could be delivered into any area that is mishtameres by the woman. Incredible. The Tanya Namihachi Gabi Ganov, we find a similar halacha by a thief. Listen to this. By theft. So I will say, remember, Torah, Gemara is not quoting the pasuk, it's called to a pasuk outside. The pasuk is, Himatze timatze biyado hagneva. If, right, a person, Ruvain, steals an item. If you find the stolen item in Ruvain's hand, mishor va'ad chamor atzeh chayim shnayim mishal. There's a concept that if a person, Ruvain, steals something, and you find the stolen object in his possession, he has to pay kefel. He has to pay a double amount. So we'll say, so once again, the Torah employs the Lasson of im himatze timatze biyado, if you find in his hand. So the Gemara says, so inli eliyado, I only know that if you find it in the Ganav's hand, he has to pay double. Gago, chatzero, karfifo minai. How do I know that if you find the stolen item, we'll say in his property, that you also have to pay double amount? Talmud Lamar, himatze timatze mikol makom. The pasuk says, we'll say same lashon, himatze timatze, wherever the item is found. I will say now, I just want to point out over here, what are we talking about? So we'll say, what we're talking about over here, and this is fascinating. Rashi says this later, let me just tell you right now. When we think about theft, right, ultimately again, how do you steal something? No one would know, but I'm saying, maybe you have a friend, right? So I'll say, so what do? You take an item with your hand, and you take it as your own. There's another way to steal. Imagine for a moment, Ruvain is in his house, and Shimon's animal walks into his house. Right? Shimon's animal walks into his house. And what does Ruvain do? Ruvain purposely closes the door with the intention of keeping Shimon's animal. So I will say, this is a fascinating case where Ruvain has effectively stolen the animal of Shimon, but has not done anything with his hands. Instead, what has he done? He's utilized his property to effect theft. So that's really what I will say. So again, the Torah, when it speaks about kefel, speaks about the concept of himatze timatze biyado. Right? Reuven has stolen with his hands. How do I know that if Reuven even steals with his property, right? Either actively steals with his property or maintains the stolen property, it's the stolen item in his property that is going to be chayiv kefel. So I will say, so himatze timatze, this double lashon. Utzricha. Now I will say, here's what's interesting. So now I have two examples, one by Gittin, right? One by Gittin and one by theft. That halacha l'maaseh, even though the Torah uses the lashon of yado, hand, yad doesn't just mean hand. Rather, what does yad mean? What does yad mean? Yad means any area that is mishtameres, any area that is guarded and secured by you. So it could be your hand, but it could also be your property. So why do I need to be taught the same concept in two different areas of halacha, one by get and one by theft? I'll tell you why. If the Torah would have just told me that it's not just yad, yad doesn't just mean hand, but yad means any area that is guarded and secure. That if the get falls there, or if the get is placed there, she can be divorced. I would have said like this: Mishum debal karcha megarsha. See, Rabbi say at the end of the day, get is a little bit different. Why is get unique, Rabbi say? Because a woman could be divorced against her will. So once it could be divorced against her will, I could hear the logic of saying that if the husband just drops it into her property, then halacha l'maaseh she's divorced. However, aval ganov, the lessei bal karcha, but ultimately, again, I will say, remember again, there is no such concept, ultimately, again, of a ganov, right? There's no such thing as being a thief against your will. A thief against your will, right? So therefore, again, perhaps I would have thought that kinyan chatzar doesn't work by a ganov. So the Gemara says, Imalo, v'yashru en gabe ganov, therefore it has the teaching about ganov as well. V'yashru en gabe ganov, and had the Torah just taught me the concept of kinyan chatzar by a ganov, I would have said, mishum de kansi rachmana. Well, so maybe it's a knas. maybe it's a knas, maybe it's a penalty. Maybe it's a penalty. Aval get, emalo, but by get, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, I would have thought that chasher doesn't work, therefore it's tzvicha. So I will say, even though both cases are really teaching me the same principle, right? What's the same principle? The same principle that the chasher has the ability to go ahead and acquire on my behalf, but I could not have learned out one case from the other. So therefore I will say, what comes out is as follows. We're going to leave aside the Ganav case, although it is interesting to see that again, Yado by Ganav teaches me that not only is a Ganav chayiv and kefil if he steals with his hand, or ultimately again if the object is found in his hand, but it can even be chayiv kefil if he steals with his chotzer, if he steals with his property. Fine. Back to Gittin. So I will say, so now what we've been introduced to is the following idea. That my entire life of Gittin, over the last 77 days, right, I've thought there's only one way for a man to divorce his wife, and that's for a husband to place a get in his wife's hand. This Mishnah changed my life, and now I understand that what? Reuven, the husband, could even throw a get into the chutzner or into the home of Rachel, his wife. Why? How do I know that? V'nasan biyada. Had the Torah wanted to limit the giving of a get to the hand, it would have said, biyada yitnena. Right? Biyada yitnena. V'nasan biyada means the ikar is there has to be an asina, an act of giving. Where does the act of giving have to, or where does it have to be given to? A place that resembles her yad. What's unique about her yad? What's unique about her hand? One word. What's unique? Mishtameres. Right? It is guarded and secure. So too the get must be delivered into a location that is guarded and secure. Beautiful. So it says, one second. Chazera, how could Reuven throw the get into her chotzer? Masha kanse isha kanabayla. Because we have a concept, whatever a woman has acquired, a husband acquired is as well. So I don't understand. I will say this is right. This goes back to our Kiddushin days. From Kiddushin days from the last cycle. Right? So I will say, so remember again, we have a concept that when a couple is married, whatever a wife acquires, her husband acquires. That's true with whatever she acquires with her hand, right? It's true with whatever she acquires with her chatzar. So if he throws it into her chatzar, isn't he effectively taking it from one hand and putting it into another? To which the Gemara says, Amar Lazar v'kol sevla din udvarim einli benechsayich. So Rabbi Lazar has an interesting position over here. Rabbi Lazar says, what's the case? He writes to her, I have no rights in your property. Shabbos is very interesting. Right, so according to Rabbi Lazar, if you look at Rashi, to Kasavla, Hashda Mashal the Kasavla Kain Achar Shekansa. Shabbos says, Rabbi Lazar says, you're right, in order for this to work, before he throws the get into her chatzar, what does he have to do? He has to go ahead and write in her document, I no longer have any rights in your property. So he relinquishes the rights in her property, then throws her the get. V'chi Kasavla Hachi My Havi. I will say, I don't understand. If you own something and you say, I have no rights in this anymore, does that work? But Tanabos said, listen to this interesting case. Ha'omer lechavero. I will say, the case over here is Reuven and Shimon own a piece of property in joint ownership. Right? They jointly own it. Now watch this. And Reuven doesn't want to be involved with Shimon anymore. So what does he do? He writes, Din udvaran ein li asadazu. I have nothing to do with this field. Ainly a sekba, I have no business in it. My hands are removed from it. So we'll say, so essentially, what is Reuven trying? Let's be clear. What is Reuven trying to do? What is he trying to do? He doesn't want to be involved in this anymore. So he's trying to relinquish his ownership interest. How is he doing it? Right? I have nothing to do with this field. I have no business with it. My hands are removed from it. Lo amar klum. He has said nothing. Right? Now we'll say, why has he said nothing? It's actually very interesting. Why has he said nothing? Because there's a way halachically, transactionally, to remove yourself from an ownership interest. And just saying, I'm not involved, does not work. So I will say, so therefore the Gemara says, if a husband owns rights in his wife's property, simply saying, I'm not involved, doesn't work. I will say, by the way, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this. So you'll say, if you're involved in something, and you no longer want to be involved in it because it's become problematic, just simply walking away doesn't work. You have to resolve conflict. right? You have to resolve issues. Say, if you think about it, in this case over here, Reuven, who's a partner with Shimon, he doesn't want to be partners with Shimon anymore for whatever the reason. So what's his strategy? Right? I'm out. It doesn't exist. Halacha says that doesn't work. If there's a problem, there's a way to extract yourself from the problematic situation. But kind of just flipping the switch and saying, not my problem, right? Not my issue. Generally, that doesn't work in life. It doesn't work in partnerships. It doesn't work in marriage. It doesn't work in most relationships. When there is an issue and you need to extricate yourself from the situation, just simply pretending like you're no longer involved isn't usually a resolution. A person's going to have to go through the steps to resolve whatever the underlying issues are in order to be able to extricate oneself from the circumstance. Incredible yisod. So therefore the Gemara says as follows. Therefore the Gemara says, oh, what's the case over here? It's actually interesting, a bit complicated, but the Gemara says, no. The case over here is talking about when Reuven and Rachel got married. When they had Erusin, so we'll say, remember again, let's take a step back. What's driving our problem over here, right? What's our problem? We're being introduced to the concept that Reuven is divorcing his wife. How is he divorcing his wife? Right? Throwing a get where? Her chatzar. So what mechanism is he employing? What mechanism? Kinyan chatzar. Good. So Gemara says, whoa. How? Step one is how does kinyan chatzar work? How do we know it works by Gittin? Fine. Gemara says, 1 second. Why does this work at all? A husband has the rights over his wife's chatzar. So essentially, when he throws her the get, what is he essentially halachically doing it? What is he doing? Taking it from one hand and putting it into a different hand of his. So we're trying to figure out how could a kinyan chatzar work. So Rabbi Lazar comes along and says, what's the case? Rabbi Yanai says, Bekosev lava oda arusa. We'll say, he is going ahead and writing her when they're in Erusin. I will say, a husband only acquires rights over his wife's property after nisuin, after full-fledged marriage. So we'll say, the Rabbi Yanai is saying, what's the case? While she's still in arusa, he writes to her, Din udvarim eni benechsayich. I have no rights over her property, over your property. Shabbos say this is an Erusin before he receives rights over her property. Ukid Rav Kana, Rav Kana, Nachla habalo li adam mimakom acher, adam masna aleh shelo yirashena. Well, this is very interesting. So ultimately, again, according to the position of Rav Kahana says, when a person is going to acquire a right that is coming to him from another source, he has the ability to say, I don't want to acquire it. I will say, watch this. There are two different concepts I play over here. Excuse me. So we'll say two different concepts. I'm good, Greg, I'm good. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we'll say, so listen to this. In case number one, we're talking about when you already have a halachic right to something, saying, I don't want it anymore, doesn't work. It was going to have to be a more formal process for you to untangle your ownership interest. That's different than in a state where you don't yet have a right. If I'm going to have a situation where I'm in a state right now, I don't have a particular halachic entitlement, but I'm going to have it. So I will say, before the right is vested in me, I have the ability to say, I don't want it. And just by saying I don't want it, that's enough to prevent it from devolving upon me. So watch this. When does a husband acquire rights in his wife's property? When does he acquire rights? When? Nisuin. So I will say, if during Erusin, which is before he had right, during Erusin he says, I don't want rights in my wife's property, simply saying I don't want it is enough to prevent him from acquiring it. So Rabbi will say, okay, so just follow the train of thought over here. So therefore Rabbi Yanai says, what's the case of a husband who has the ability to throw the get into his wife's chatzar, right? What's the case? It must be where Reuven, the husband, during Erusin said, I don't want to have rights in my wife's property. And I will say, you could do that. In other words, you have the ability to decline a right that is coming your way. Rava says, Ha'omer, we'll say on the base, Ha'omer, I'f shi b'takanas chachamim kigon zu, shomelo. We'll say, Rav Ashi says, if a person says, I don't want the benefit that Chazal are conferring upon me. He says, Kigon Zu, like this case. We'll discuss what Kigon Zu is. Sheleima. I will say, by the way, this is intuitive. If Chazal gave you a right, and you would like to waive that right, you have the ability to do so. Now, I will say, the kunz, a little bit of the catch that Rabbi Yana is coming up with is, when do you have to decline that right? When do you have to decline it? When? Before it's vested in you. Right? Or is that, I don't know if it's right English, right? Before you've acquired the right. Say Rabbi say again, Mikey Gonzu, what's an example of this? Kid Rafuna Amarav, Dam Rafuna Amarav, but say 77b, 3 lines down. Yechola Isha Shotomer Labaila, Emimizonis Ve'eniosa. So say, what's a good example of this, of declining a benefit that Chazal conferred upon you? Chazal said to a woman that ultimately, again, her husband is obligated to support her. Right? Husband obligated to support her now. Remember again, in return for that support, what does she have to do? Any earnings she has to go ahead and give to her husband. Let's say a woman says, no thank you, I am declining support. Now we'll say, if a woman declines support, what does she get? She gets to keep her own earnings. So you can easily see a case like this. Let's say a woman has her own successful career, right? She says, thank you very much. I appreciate the offer of support, Chazal, but I'm good, right? I'm happy to keep my own earnings. She has the right to do so. What you see over here is a person could decline a right that is coming their way. Now, just to be clear, so just follow the flow of the conversation over here. Step 1, Mishnah introduces me to the concept that a husband doesn't have to hand the get directly to his wife, but rather he has the ability to throw it into her property. Okay? Step 2, we learned out where does this concept come from in the pasuk. Fine. Step 3 is a bam kasha, right? Bam question. What's the bam question? Again, how could a husband hand a get into his wife's property? He has the rights over that property. So essentially, is that not tantamount of taking it from one hand of the husband and putting it to a second hand? So we're trying to figure out now, how could this work? So the latest, what Rabbi Yanai wants to suggest, is it must be that he's declining rights in the chatzar. That's the case. He must now, what's the wrinkle in that? According to this, when does he have to decline the rights in the chatzar? When? During Erison. Before the rights vest in him. Right? Because apparently, again, if it's during Yisuin, just saying, I don't want rights, that's not really going to work. It's not really going to work. So it must be that during Erison, before the rights vested in him, he says, I don't want this. And that works because whenever Chazal institutes something for the benefit of a person has the right to say, thank you, but no thank you. Okay, fine. So let's say comes along Rava. We'll say Rava changes our life. Rava says, 1 second. So Rava Amar, Atu Yada Milo Kanye Lebal. So we'll say, Rava says, by the way, if you're going to get caught up in this ownership piece, we'll say, isn't her hand acquired, a wife's hand, isn't her hand acquired by her husband as well? Now we'll say, we're going to ask on this, but remember, technically speaking, a husband has certain rights over his wife's hand. What do I mean by that? As we just said before, a husband is entitled to her earnings. Right? It was like Rachel's walking down the street. She finds $100 bill on the ground. She picks it up. Technically speaking, who does that $100 bill belong to? Who does it belong to? Her husband. He is zakai b'mitziasa. He has entitlement ultimately again to whatever she finds. So Rava says, if you're going to get worked up about the fact that the husband owns the chatzar, hey, guess what? The husband has certain ownership rights in her hand as well. So you could ask, how could a husband ever put a get into his wife's hand? After all, isn't putting a get into her hand halachic equivalent of taking it from one of his hands and putting it into the other hand? To which the what do you have to say? Ella, rather, what you have to say, and this is the best, is halachic simultaneity. Jose, what you have to say is, just like in a regular get, what happens? The moment the husband puts the get into her hand, say, what's happening in that moment? She's divorced. And when she's divorced, what does she have full autonomy over now? Her hand. And how does that happen? Simultaneously. Halachic simultaneity. We'll say everything is happening in the same moment. Therefore, again, halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says, Hachanami, Gita v'chatzera, bain ke'echad. Beautiful. Beautiful. Absolutely stunning. Right? So Rava says, you guys are getting worked up about all the wrong stuff. You're right. There's an issue. Husband has rights over the chutzner. Husband has rights over the yad. Absolutely true. But remember again, all of this is working through halachic simultaneity. Put the get in her hand, she acquires the get and her hand. Put the get in the chutzner, she acquires the get and the chutzner. And when does it happen? It all happens in the very same moment. Beautiful. Beautiful. Amar Ravina Ravashi. Ravina says Ravashi. So first of all, we'll say, go back for just a moment. Rava yad di isha kakashile. Rava said, now here's what's interesting. Rava said, remember, the way Rava got to all of this was, Rava was saying, before you get worried about her chutzner, be worried about her yad. After all, again, you're getting all worked up that the husband owns her chutzner. Doesn't he also own her yad? To which the Gemara says, no. The Gemara wants to say, Rava, you're wrong. A husband does not own his wife's hand. It will say, a husband doesn't own any part of his wife's body. He says, the yada gufa mika kanile. Let's remember again, a husband has an entitlement to a right. Or I should say, a husband has a right to certain things. He has a right to her earnings. That does not mean he owns her hand. He doesn't own her hand. Right? We'll say again, remember, the only time you could possibly own another person is in what type of situation? What type of situation? Avdos. You could own your Eved Kinani, because an Eved Kinani is like Karka. A husband cannot own his wife. So the Gemara is just clarifying this. Rava, a husband doesn't own his wife's hand. He may be entitled to her earnings. He may be entitled to what she finds, but ultimately, again, is not entitled to her hand. Amalei Rava. So the Gemara says, Amalei Rava. So Rava says, you're right. Yad ha'eved kakashili. You're right. The case that I was really referring to, I will say, is not the hand of a woman, but rather I will say the case of an eved Knani. Listen to this. Lemandar b'shtay de atzmo yad eved k'ad rabo damya. We'll say, listen to this. Rava was saying, here was my kasha case. My kasha case was like this. We'll say, remember we spoke about this before. You want to emancipate your eved Knani. Emancipate your eved Knani. What do you need in order to emancipate your eved Knani? What do you need? A shtar shecher. I will say, there's a concept that, let's say I own, right? I own an Eved Kinani. I want to emancipate him. So what do? I take the shtar shecher, I take the document of emancipation, and I put it in his hand. But why should that work? We'll say, who owns the hand of the Eved Kinani? Who owns it? I own it, the master. So putting a get shecher in the hands of the Eved Kinani, is that not the equivalent of taking it from one hand and putting it into another hand? Rather, elegita v'yada ba'in ke'echad, hachanami, gita v'chatzera ba'in ke'echad. So this is very interesting. Rather, again, what you have to say is, so why does it work? Once again, halachic simultaneity. So I will say the same way when I place the get shechor in the hands of the Eved, so again, he acquires his yad and his get at the same time. Rava was just using this as an example, so Rava said Rava is just applying halachic simultaneity to the case of the chatzah. So Rava said this is really very exciting. So now Rava said, now I have a full picture. Here's what I know. Step one. Your husband doesn't have to deliver the get directly into the hand of his wife. He could put it into her chatzah. Where do I know that from? V'nasan biyada. How does that work? After all, doesn't husband have rights over her chatzar? And therefore, isn't it the equivalent of taking it from one hand and putting it into a second hand? What's the answer? Halachic simultaneity. Rava, halachic simultaneity. Gita, here's the phrase to remember. Gita, the chatzera, ba'in ke'echad. She acquires her get and her chatzar at the same time. Halachic simultaneity. Beautiful. We'll say a story. Chaya Mira. The kasav lagidol advisu bahadi panya demali shabsa. So let's say here's the case. There was a guy, Ruvain. Ruvain was a shchimira, deathly ill. He wrote a get to his wife. And everyone say, why is he writing a get to his wife? We know why is he writing a get to his wife, right? Yibum, right? That's all these cases. He wants to go ahead And halacha, I mean, it doesn't have to be the only case, but that's the case over here. You'll see why in just a moment. We'll say you could have another case. Well, let's say, whatever, it doesn't matter why. Anyway, so we'll say, in this case, though, it is a Yibum consideration, as we're going to see. So halacha lamaisa, so Ruvain is deathly ill, Chaya Mira, writes to get to his wife on Erev Shabbos. So I'll say, what was the problem? He didn't get a chance to give it to her before Shabbos. L'machar takif le'alma. Also, on the next day, his health really deteriorated, right? And his death was imminent. Now, we'll say, here was the problem. Now the problem is, apparently at this point in time, he was unable to give it to her, also coupled with the fact that it is Shabbos. So we'll say, so what happened? Asul kamei de Rava. They came before Rava. And Rava said, here's what you should do. Amr lahu, zilu amrulei, likanye nihile lahu duchta, tiyase begida. Tell Ruvain, the Chaya Mira, to convey ownership over the property where the get is situated. V'tezel ihi v'seichud v'siftach v'tachsik bei. And let Rachel go over to the piece of property. Let her open the door, close the door, right? Do something to make a chazaka. I will say chazaka is a proprietary act. Right? Disnan, na'al geder, uparatz kolshu. If a person closes a fence, makes a breach in the fence, any amount, hare zu chazaka. Ultimately, again, it's a chazaka. So I'll say, so Rava essentially said, tell Ruvain the Chaya Mira to go ahead and convey ownership, ultimately, again, over the area which the get is situated. Tell Rachel to go do a proprietary act over the area, and ultimately, again, she'll be divorced. Good. So I'll say, so take a look at Tosos in just a moment. So by the way, just I want to point out over here that Rashi understands, we're not going to get into this, but Rashi understands what's happening over here is we're employing a kinyan chatzar, essentially, although Rashi seems to use a lashon of kinyan agav, but we'll leave that on the side. For our purpose, let's keep it simple. So, therefore, once Rachel acquires the property, what else does she acquire over here? What else does she acquire? Anything situated on the property. What happens to be situated on this property? What's situated on the property? Her get. Therefore, she'll acquire the chatzar, she'll acquire the get, and sheleimah Yisrael. Tosos, we'll say just a very quick look at Tosos. V'tezel ivetech v'tiftach perush ha'shlefisha get asol taltel l'mosra la af agav debitosef daperak b'ashil Tanya in megarshin b'Shabbos b'shchiv meirahi kilu telo tipo kame yavam. So we'll say it's a very interesting halacha l'maisa. Rashi points out over here that even though we don't get divorced on Shabbos, nevertheless, and the get itself is muktzah, this was a case of Chaya Mira. They wanted to avoid yibum, and therefore they relaxed certain rabbinic strictures in order to allow this divorce to occur. Fine. So I'll say, so essentially what's happening over here is a kinyan chatzar, right? Rachel acquires the property, and by acquiring the property, ultimately again, she becomes divorced. So Rav Elisheva says, Rava, masha kanse isha kana baila. So we'll say, aren't we running into, so Rav Elisheva said, 1 second, the husband has rights over the chatzar. His rights over the chatzar. Salacha l'maise isn't the get still under his ownership? Echsif, Rava was embarrassed. L'sofik lo'im ilsa da'arusa habi. We'll say, then it turned out that in fact the husband was an arusa. I'm sorry, they were in Erusin. She was an arusa. They didn't have nisuin. Therefore, he did not yet have rights over her property. Amar Rava. Rava says, no, don't worry about him. So if they said this about Nisua, they say about Arusa. Hada Amar Rava, lo shna Arusa v'lo shna Nesua. Doesn't make a difference if she's an Arusa or a Nesua. Kita v'chatzera ba'in ke'echad. Rava said again, the get is halachic simultaneity. I, v'ha Amar Rava meikara. Rava already said this earlier. Ki Amar Rava aha maisa. We'll say Rava said this position, originally he espoused this position regarding this particular case. Said Rabbi say again, this was just a story to illustrate the concept. Rabbi say, but bottom line, the halachic reasoning for the concept of kinyan chatzar ultimately again working, I will say, is why? Halachic simultaneity. So when a husband throws the get into her chatzar, even though he may have usage rights over that chatzar, halacha l'maisa halachic simultaneity says, Gita v'chatzera ba'in ke'echad. Ultimately, again, her get, and therefore, again, her rights over the chatzar occur simultaneously. So they both say, bottom line, this is the logic we accept. Ultimately, again, for kinyan chatzar by Gittin, halachic simultaneity, Gita v'chatzera ba'in ke'echad. Beautiful. The Hebrew Soch Beisa. So I will say, so remember again, going back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, he throws it into her house. Now it's interesting, the Mishnah said that she is standing in her house. Right? That was Lasson the Mishnah. She's standing in her house. So the Gemara says, Amru Ula, so Rava says again, all of these cases only work if literally she is standing by her chaser, she's standing by her house. Okay. Rabbi Oshia Amar Afilu hi b'Tiveria v'chatzera b'tzipori hi b'tzipori v'chatzera b'Tiveria migurashas. Rabbi Oshia says no, she does not need to be standing in her house, right, or in her chatzera, right? Even if she's in one location and her house and her chatzera is in a different location, halacha l'maaseh it works. But that's not what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah literally said that she's in her house or she is in her chatzah. That was the Lasson of the Mishnah. So which the Gemara says, Hachi Katani. This is what it means to say. Vehi kimi shebesoch beisa, vehi kimi shebesoch chatzera. So it's like to which the Gemara answers, no. What it means is, it's as if she's standing in her chatzah, as if she is standing next to her house. I will say, what does that mean? So Moishe says, she doesn't literally have to be standing in the house or literally standing next to the chatzar. Rather, it just has to be as if she is standing there. We'll say, what does that mean, as if? What does as if mean? Mishtameres. Both say, this goes back to my both say, what's the definition? What does mishtameres mean? What does mishtameres mean? Mishtameres literally means guarded. What does guarded mean? Guarded means it's a safe and secure location. How do you create a safe and secure location? Either fence it in, right? Literally fence it in, or literally standing there. So as long as the location is guarded and safe, Rav Oshia says she does not have to be standing there. Ula says she has to be standing there. Says the Gemara, what are they arguing about? One opinion says, we'll say, why does chatzar work? Because chatzar is an extension of one's hand. That will say that would be the position of ula. Just like your hand is next to you, so you have to be next to your chatzar. Other opinion says no. We'll say, why does chatzar work? Chatzar is like shlichos, right? Your property is like your agent. Just like your agent doesn't have to be next to you, so you don't need to be standing right next to your property for it to work either. Tushar says no, lo. Not true. Everyone agrees that we'll say chatzar is an extension of yad. It's very interesting. We'll say your property works because your property is an extension of your hand. So what's the machlokes? Mar savar ki yada, ma yada bismucha, af chatzar bismucha. So Ula will say, just like your hand literally is next to you, so to your chatzar has to be next to you. The idach. We'll say, Roshia will say, well, if that was true, ima yada bidvuka, af chatzar bidvuka. Why don't we say just like your hand is attached to you, your chatzar has to be attached to you, which of course would be ridiculous. Ela ki yada, ma yada mishtameres ladaita, av chatzar mishtameres ladaita. So we'll say, so again, the second opinion in Roshia will say, no, just like your yad, Rabbi says mishtameres, right? Your yad, your hand is a secure location, so too your chatzar has to be secure. But it doesn't require you to be right there in physical proximity. La fuke, chatzera mishtameres shelo ladaita. Ultimately, come to exclude a case of a chatzar that is not mishtar. So both say, so this is another yisodistic machlokes. So both say, it's very, very, very exciting. So now that I know that there's a concept in chatzar, now that I know why chatzar works, now I know about halachic simultaneity. Now I both say, now I know a fourth thing, which is, why does chatzar work? Chatzar, my property, is considered to be an extension of my yad, of my hand. This births an interesting machlokes. Shabbos say, so where do I have to be in proximity to my chatzar for my chatzar to work? Ula says, well, you have to be right there. Just like your yad is samach, your yad is next to you. For your chatzar to work, you have to have proximity as well. Rabbi Shia says, no, I don't need proximity. What do I need? Mishtameres. Just like my hand is a secure location, so too my chatzar needs to be a secure location. And if my chatzar is secure, even if I am not in proximity, ultimately again my chatzar will come. So we'll have to stop over here for today. Again, we'll see how to resolve that machlokes tomorrow. Hashem. Mazel tov on starting a new parak. Incredible.